Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our tips and tricks webinar. Today's topic is sizing for consolidation and new features. Please use the Q&A chat if you have any questions during the webinar. We'll make sure we get to those. Our presenter today is an SE out of Virginia, Keely Wilkins. Keely, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Keely. I am an SE, as Rob just mentioned, out of Virginia. I am on the commercial side. So I wanted to revisit an oldie but a goodie today. So sizing, not just one-for-one sizing, but for consolidation of architecture, of features, and for adding new features. And I'm going to be using a customer example for this. The reason being, a couple of months back, one of my customers came to me and said, they needed to accomplish X, Y, and Z. We'll get into that in a minute. And they needed to size for it. Like, okay, it's not a straight one-for-one. They're not, replacing hardware. They have hardware already. They have viable hardware, but they wanted to consolidate features. So is their hardware that they currently have going to be enough, or do they need to consider other options? And then I started to realize that this is a fading art with the growth into cloud. Our necessity to actually, do the math to size for this type of environment on-prem with traditional hardware is becoming less and less necessary, because the cloud will grow and shrink to your need. But there is still a very strong business need to have at least part of your environment on-prem. In more industries, it's well, in some industries, it's more prevalent than others. So I just wanted to take a few moments and walk through what that journey was for us. So as I mentioned, we're going to be using a customer example. The business requirements, so there's always something business related, organizational related, driving the technical objectives, and then how we go about to get into the recommendations. So there's the life cycle support policy. So we want to make sure that the hardware and the software is still viable, at least for a couple of years. The appliance sizing tool, which is typically, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's internal. So I think Checkpoint internal and the partners may have access to it, but I don't believe the customers do.
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, thank you. And then good old fashioned math. It's not hard math, it's basic math. Not even high school math, I don't think, but the logic behind it is a little more robust than basic math. And then other considerations. And then we'll walk through a quick summary. So my customer had three objectives. They wanted to upgrade from R8010 to R8040. They wanted to consolidate web security appliance, WSA features, into the CP gateway. Because the WSA that they're using is going to reach end of life soon. Actually, it's next month that they're reaching end of life. So the two features they wanted to consolidate were HTTPS inspection and URL filtering. They also wanted to route their NetScaler traffic through the gateway. All right, so my first question to myself is, can the current gateway support this? So let's take a look at the business requirements, because there's going to be more questions. So every business requirement I've seen in the last 30-something years, plus in undergrad and grad school, return on investment and total cost of ownership. Are we getting what we paid for? Are we paying too much for what we have? And then the technical requirements for this, they want to consolidate functionality. They want to, take features from just separate systems onto a single system. So they need a path forward. We need analysis done. And they also wanted to calculate the cost of internal staff performing work versus engaging vendor services. So this is something more and more customers are engaging in part because doing projects like this require specific skill sets. So not all internal folks have the skill sets necessary, or they don't have the time. So for them to get the skill set necessary, it takes time out of their dailies to get training, maybe certified, get acclimated to the environment. And if they have other priorities, they don't have that time. So oftentimes it's beneficial to spend a little extra money to get either the partner's professional services or Checkpoint's professional services involved to get that work performed. So the first thing I did is I checked the support lifecycle policy. If you're not familiar with that, it is viewable via our main website under support services. So I did check the current equipment. They have 2 pair of 15600s running R8010. So the 15600s are end of sale as of December 2020, but they're good for support until 2025. And R8010 will reach end of support January 2022, but R8040 is good until January 2024. So that's good news. That means that at a base level, what they're working with is viable. So let me just jump over to the lifecycle policy. If you're not familiar with this, it is on, like I mentioned, our support page. And it will give you the latest announcements, software support. So what software is currently viable, what's coming up, your life cycle for what you have, and appliances support. And then the next thing we take a look at, or I took a look at anyway, is the appliance sizing tool. And if you've done any scaling with your SE, they probably asked you for 1 or 2 specific numbers. 1, your total throughput, and or the total number of users. And this is why, because we have an internal sizing tool that will ask your SE a few questions about the environment, like where you are and where you want to go to. So the first thing it's going to ask is the package details. So what level of features are going to be enabled? So is it Gen 5? Is it next gen? Just the firewall and IPS, just the firewall? And then number 2, you can either use the CP size me file or enter those 2 numbers. And then lastly, it's going to ask if it's a virtual system or the traditional security gateway. So if you're like me and you're a dork, or you're just, you need to know what's behind all of this, plug in a number and get a recommendation back because you want to stand by your word, then in the upper right-hand corner of that page, there is a link to a document that lists most, if not all, of the assumptions in the web page. This is just one of many. So the traffic blend description. So this is an aggregate of all of the data and types that Checkpoint sees across its userscape, for lack of a better term, and how it's distributed. So web traffic tends to take up 90%, email about 2%, and other, which is DNS, Telnet, and FTP about 8%. So this is just one of many assumptions that are taken into consideration when you're using the application sizing tool. So keep in mind, since there are assumptions, this is based on probability, averages. So it doesn't account for anything out of the ordinary, anything that couldn't be predicted. And so in this scenario, when there's architecture consolidation, that's one of the things that's, well, not necessarily out of the ordinary, but can't be accounted for in this tool. So I had to go old school. So how do we answer the question of capacity for architecture consolidation? Well, I need some more information. So how does the customer want to proceed? So they want to do their upgrade first, then optimize their config, and then enable the HTTPS inspection and URL filtering on the gateways. Then they want to reroute the net scalar traffic, and then finally decommission the WSAs. Okay, so we have our path forward. And now will the customer perform the work themselves, or engage professional services. In this scenario, they have engaged professional services and the work is ongoing. So which devices are being replaced? There are 4 Cisco WSAs and has no bearing on Cisco. I've worked on the WSAs back when I was a SOC and threat analytics technical lead for Verizon. Cisco makes a good product. The WSAs was an acquisition though from Ironport. Good product. I'm glad to see that they're actually still in use because I haven't supported them since like 2016. So how much traffic, memory storage is needed? Okay, we need to define that usage per device and then aggregate the total. And I'll show you my spreadsheet in a moment. And then do the current appliances have the capacity to absorb the extra overhead? So math is required for this. So what is the extra overhead? You don't just turn on HBIS inspection and URL filtering without having some policies to limit what's actually being inspected or filtered. And then finally, well, 2 more things. So what are the dependencies for the project and for each task? Some dependencies, the order of operation, the architectural changes, budget, timing, staff, maintenance windows, PS availability, remote access. All of this plus more comes into play when you're building that plan out to do a code upgrade and consolidate architecture. And what's the timeline? So the WSAs in this case reach end of life next month. So I'm going to jump to my spreadsheet for a moment so you can see my madness firsthand. So here is this chart at the top is what I built out based on this information that the customer provided to me. So I had some questions with regard to, usage, CPU usage, capacity, the general architecture. So they have 2 pair of 15600s. They are an HA pair. The primary pair takes the bulk of the traffic. So it's not even, the traffic is not evenly distributed. So when I was doing the math for this, I made that a caveat that the traffic would be evenly distributed. So if they come back and say, oh, our primary is failing, it's like, well, because you haven't properly load balanced your HA pairs. So we also wanted to know which blades were active. Okay, so the IPsec VPN is not being used, but the other features are, so application control, URL filtering, and we will be adding additional URL filtering here. So they had 2 URL filtering solutions in place at the same time. The traffic was being routed differently, so they didn't trip over each other, thankfully. So identity awareness, threat emulation, IPS, antibot, antivirus, and cluster XL. And then the customer was able to give me the following information. I took all of that and I boiled it down to this. So the bandwidth. So the primary gateways are using about 1.3 gigabyte. And the secondary is using 0.2. So combined 1.5 or 1500 meg. And that's just for the current gateways using with the current traffic. So now we take a look at the WSAs. Okay, so got it down to bandwidth, about 518. And I have some notes here. So it's a transparent proxy for HTTP and HTTPS. And then the next piece of the puzzle is their NetScaler traffic. So they couldn't get hard numbers for me. They could only get screenshots of graphs because the individual I was dealing with is not the person managing the NetScaler. So they had to go to another team to get the data, and all they could manage to get was graphs. So I used these graphs and got it down to a summary page. Okay. And then the customer is unable to provide a growth projection for their business because their business was disproportionately hit by the pandemic situation. And I say that because they are in the healthcare industry. So they have situations that have happened in the last year and a half that they never could have predicted. So when you're asking them about sizing predictions, business predictions, they're still in to a large part, reaction mode. So asking them to predict what their usage is going to be, what their technical or business need is going to be 4 years from now, you're not going to get an answer that you can really work with. It's going to be a best guess, like most predictions are, but they don't have any confidence in the number that they're giving you. So what I did is bandwidth usage is industry-wide expected to grow 25% year over year. So I took that into consideration, and that's what I built out in this first chart. So here's our current estimate in the green, and then I did 25% year over year for the next 4 years. And 2025, if you recall, is when their device goes end of life. So they are good until the natural end of life of their device. Let me jump back to these slides. So here's just a quick recap of everything I just showed you. So the checkpoint gateways, the WSAs, and NetScaler. And here's the summary page again. So 25% year over year growth is approximately, please don't check my math, it's approximately 40% total growth over 4 years. So it's not 25 plus 25 plus 25, it's 1.25, 1.25. So I explained the 25% year growth. All right, so it assumes, so here are some of the other assumptions. Assumes that the performance data provided by the customer is accurate and stable. By stable, I don't mean stagnant, because it's not going to be stagnant. I mean stable in that it's at least somewhat predictable. They know what's on their environment. They know the traffic on their network. They can make reasonable predictions for the short term. So that's what I mean by stable. Another caveat, no additional traffic will be rerouted through these gateways and no new features will be enabled on the gateways. I mean, that's a bold assumption to apply for a 4-year term, but I'm using the data that I have. And they do have reasonable room to grow beyond the numbers that I have up top, but I list it as a caveat. So in a year or two, if their business, the demand on their network, the way that they're using technology changes, and they say, oh, well, this isn't right, your data was wrong. Okay, well, I used the data that I had to the best of my ability to provide a projection for you. So let's take another look at what's going on, and then we can run through another sizing exercise at that point, if necessary. Another assumption is that the traffic will be equally distributed between the two HA pair. So as we saw in the sheet before, it's not even close to evenly distributed. So they do have the horsepower, so to speak, to handle quite a bit more than what they're doing today. And as that demand grows, they need to, account for that via a load balancer and share that data equally amongst the two pair. So other considerations. So the network design, I mentioned load balancing. So is it a single unit? Is it an HA pair, a cluster? Is it virtual? The ISP carriers, is there single? Is there multiple? Is there a priority? If it's multiple, is there a priority of one over another? Is it failover or is it load balanced? So the VLANs, the VPNs, the DMZ, all part of the architecture that play into how traffic flows, which in turn relates to bandwidth. So the traffic volume, how much traffic, the composition of that traffic. So it's not just how much volume, but what type of traffic. The HTTPIS inspection can be heavy on performance. So that needs to be accounted for. Routing, bandwidth, syslog, SIM, SOAR. So I'm going to jump back to my handy dandy browser. So here is, we talked quick about the CV size me. There is an SK for that. And it gives plenty of information, input, output, line by line. It's very informative and helpful. I've used it myself. because it's not something that any of us do every day. So it's good to have that as a refresher. And speaking of traffic composition, so the inspection of web traffic, of secure web traffic, is heavier than most. It takes up a fair amount of performance. So here's just a best practice for HTTPS. And if this is something that you're doing now or delving into, or it's on, your future plans, one of the best practices is to, ease into it. So don't just turn on inspection and walk away. You want to pick specific traffic, see how, turn on the feature, see how it behaves, see what the overhead looks like. And if you're not comfortable doing that, by all means, reach out to your SE, reach out to TAC, and get a plan together so you can work out how to move forward with something like that, because the overhead can be significant, but it is manageable. All right, let's jump back to my happy slide. All right, so also regulatory and compliance. So if you're in an industry, if you're a DoD contractor, you're on the cusp of having a bunch of compliance requirements to enable you to keep bidding on federal contracts. So you're going to have to be CMMC and FIPS compliant. If you're in the financial industry, you have PCI. If you're in healthcare, you have HIPAA. So depending upon your industry, you have different you may have different requirements that you have to meet. And that's not typically heavy on overhead, but it's something you want to bring up to your SE, to TAC if you're dealing with that, to professional services if you're dealing with them, because if there's specific compliance requirements that you have to hit, they need to know about it, so they account for that. And of course, back to my business roots, your cost benefit analysis to deploy. So that your internal skill sets and priorities versus professional services. If your internal team is, they have full, work days with their normal daily tasks, with their normal monitoring, managing, responding to threats, whatever it is on their plate. If their days are full, they may not have the time or the skill set to dedicate to doing this right. And this is, it's not overly complex, but it's complex enough that a typo, misinterpretation of an instruction can have some trickling effects. So it's something you want to consider, at least for professional services, whether it be with your partner or with Checkpoint. And then summary. So your objectives and drivers. Why are you doing this? What needs to be accomplished and why? Your dependencies, the prerequisites to get things done, and what is it impacting? And then finally, your assumptions and projections, your caveats, your growth. Understand that there is no hard and fast formula for calculating the impact of an architecture consolidation, because there are so many variables. I'm sure somebody, a mathematician or a statistician, will just balk at me, but there's so many variables to take into consideration, even though the math is fairly simplistic. Missing the variables or miscalculating overhead could have an impact. Maybe it's a significant impact, maybe it's not a significant impact, but you need to just sit down and have a plan to move forward. So that's what I have for you today. I hope you have a few takeaways. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know.
Yeah, we have a few questions here, Keely. I think you kind of covered this, so I'll consolidate some of these questions. So how about open servers or virtual or cloud gateways or internal firewalls? Because I think you pretty much touched, your example was appliances that were perimeter. So
right. Yeah, so the same assumptions will come into play because you're doing the same work. It's just on a different platform. So your math may be a little different because it's virtual. So you're not growing and expanding endlessly like you would in a true cloud environment. You are reliant on the underlying hardware. So the resources allotted to that virtual system absolutely have to be taken into account. So you may want to test things out on a smaller environment, and then once you're ready for production, build it up to something more robust.
Yeah, like you said, every situation, every network, every customer is unique. So there's a lot of different variables to consider. The CP Seisme you showed.
Yes.
Question, is that performance impacting when it's running on a production gateway?
It is not, as I've been told by TAC. It does run for, I think 24 hours, but you can set the 8 hours to 24 hours. You can set the time when you kick it off, but to the best of my knowledge, it is not performance impacting. But it's not something you want to run on a daily basis either, just because it is, I mean, from a human perspective, time consuming.
I had a question. Can we get the slides in the spreadsheet?
Sure. Just I'll clean it up to limit my gibberish.
Yeah. Okay. Question just about your scenario here. You mentioned you mentioned cloud at the start of the presentation, but the bulk of the presentation seemed to be on-prem dedicated hardware.
Yes.
Would cloud come up into the customer's discussion in futures?
In this particular scenario, no, because they are a hospital. So they are, there are certain things that they are allowed to do, certain things they are not allowed to do. It depends, in this scenario, what their firewalls are used for could not be done in the cloud.
Right. But again, yeah, another variable to consider if that's
technically
something
it could be
that
done in the cloud. From a business perspective, it couldn't be done in the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that covered it. Let me look one more place. Yeah, great. Okay, thank you, Keely. Great information.
Thank you.
We will send a follow-up email with the reference content, some of those links. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks. You'll see the invitation for that soon. And again, the presentations are now being populated to a YouTube channel. So the recording link will be the YouTube link. That will take you to all past recordings for 2021. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Keely, and we'll see you back here next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.